Chapter 4. Mum's the Word. Elliot didn't know what to do. He couldn't find Mum anywhere, and it was now completely dark. He considered calling the police, but if they found Mum before he did, where could she have gone this time? He ran into the kitchen for the 10th time, trying to keep the sickening panic at bay. He would find her. He always did. In that moment of reason, he finally noticed her pink gardening gloves on the kitchen table. He grabbed his coat, and Mum's, and headed out to the fields. As he ran across the farm, he could just discern a tiny figure in the darkness up ahead. He breathed a sigh of relief. There was Mum, kneeling on the grass, happily planting vegetables in the empty field. On his approach, he could hear her chatting away to the empty space, occasionally breaking into a cheery song. He remembered a time when Mum had seemed so much bigger than him, when one of her hugs could smother him in a warm embrace of rose-scented love, lit up by her wicked laugh. "I blew into England on a breeze," she would giggle in an accent that wasn't familiar and wasn't strange. "I am a child of the world." It made her seem almost magical, but these days she seemed so small, so fragile, so old. Elliot wished he'd asked her more about her life while he'd had the chance. Elliot hurried over to where Mum was busily digging and slipped her coat gently over her shoulders. She turned around and her face shone in 100 places as it always did when she saw him. She pushed her messy brown hair out of her face and reached up to give her boy a hug. "So how was your day?" she smiled. "Really great," Elliot lied. "Top of the class in history." "You're so clever, Ellie," she laughed, rubbing some soil on his nose. "Must take after you, Mum. So what are you plant—" He stopped as he realised what his mother was doing. A packet of unopened carrot seeds lay by her side, and she was putting the final loving touches to planting a row of clothes pegs. Elliot's heart plummeted. She was doing it again. "Come on, Mum, it's cold. Let's get you inside." Elliot helped her up and gently guided her back towards the house. He settled her in the lounge, lit the fire, and went to the kitchen to prepare their supper. Elliot couldn't pinpoint exactly when Mum started acting strangely. She'd always been strange, but in a good way, dancing around the shops or doing handstands in the street. But something had changed. The last year had passed in such a blur of worrying about Nan and Grandad when they were ill, then grieving for them when they died, that he hadn't really noticed Mum's odd behaviour until a few months ago. It began with small things. She'd lose something she'd had 2 minutes ago, or couldn't remember the name of a person or a place. At first, Elliot thought these were the normal short circuits of a stressed and tired mind. But the memory lapses soon became more serious, forgetting there was food in the oven or leaving the bath running. Then one day, Elliot came home from school and Mum was nowhere to be found. He ran down the path to the village and found her in the middle of the road in her nightdress, lost and confused with no idea where she lived. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Mum needed his help. By doing all the shopping, cooking and housework, Elliot had convinced himself that everything was going to be okay. But deep down he knew that Mum needed a doctor. Josie's mind was unwell, and it was getting worse. But it wasn't that simple. What if a doctor said Mum was too ill to look after him? What if they took her away? What would happen to him then? Elliot had no other family. He didn't even know if his dad was alive. Elliot and his mother had always lived with his grandparents, and Elliot only knew 2 things about his father. He'd given Elliot his pocket watch as a baby, and he wasn't there now. Elliot never knew where he had gone or why, and whenever he asked, Mum would get upset and say he was too young to understand. "Now's not the time," she'd say, holding his face in her hands. "One day I'll explain everything." Elliot wasn't sure now if that day would ever come. Besides, his mother and grandparents had made him happier than any dad could have. His dad obviously didn't care about him, so he wasn't going to care back. Elliot quickly checked his pocket to make sure the watch hadn't fallen out when he'd run outside. No, It was better this way. Mum had looked after him all his life, and now it was his turn to look after her. If he could just keep everyone else's noses out, they'd be fine. Really. Elliot opened the kitchen cupboard, even though he knew exactly what it contained. A box of tea bags, some stale digestives, 3 small tins of beans, and half a loaf of bread. He looked in the chipped cookie jar that guarded their weekly spending money and counted the remaining £3.76 inside. He put the £20 he had borrowed from Mrs. Portley Plum's handbag into the jar and added an IOU to all the other notes reminding him that he needed to pay someone back. He'd had to borrow a lot of money lately. There were a lot of IOUs in the jar. Nan and Grandad had never trusted banks, and the farm used to provide most of their food, so they kept their life savings in a tin under the bed. Elliot was careful to use as little of the money as he could, but he knew it was running out, and there were only so many vegetables he and Mum could grow. Over time, the farm workers had left, and the animals were sold, all except Bessie, the lame cow Elliot had raised from a calf who lived in the derelict cowshed across the paddock. Elliot's early morning paper round brought in a bit of money, but there was barely enough for the basics, let alone the expensive things he needed for school. He remembered Mr. Boyle's moan about his uniform and made a mental note to sew some buttons on his only shirt and polish the shoes that had been too tight since Easter. "Beans on toast all right for tea, Mum?" he called through to the lounge. "Lovely, baby. Haven't had that for a while," she replied cheerfully. Mum's forgetfulness worried Elliot a lot, but if it stopped her from remembering that beans on toast had been their supper every night for the past 3 weeks, perhaps it wasn't all bad. He made their meal, and they snuggled in front of their small black and white TV to watch a cooking competition Mum enjoyed on Friday nights. She used to be an amazing cook, and Elliot laughed as she colourfully insulted the contestants' efforts. "I wouldn't serve that with a tennis racket," she yelled at one woman's attempt at a baked Alaska. But by 9 o'clock, Mum was falling asleep in her chair. She slept a lot these days. Elliot gently woke her and helped her upstairs. He laid her nightdress out on the bed, left the room while she changed, then came back to say goodnight. "Do you have everything you need?" he asked, as he always did when he tucked the sheets around her. "Do I have you?" she asked with a sleepy smile. "Always," whispered Elliot. "Then what more could I want?" whispered Josie as she pulled him into a hug. "Good night, my little miracle." He stayed for a few moments until Mum fell asleep, then crept quietly out of the room and shut the door. Elliot returned to the empty lounge, cleared away the supper things, and sank down into the comfy armchair. He clicked open the gold cover of his pocket watch, observing the exposed cogs as they ticked the seconds away. He didn't feel like going to bed, so he flicked the TV on again. The elderly set could only receive 4 channels, 3 if it was windy, and when he came across a documentary, he remembered Mr. Boyle's test on Monday. For a moment, Elliot considered studying the unopened history book on the coffee table, then saw the mountain of bills and letters next to it. Each one was more threatening than the last. Water, gas, electricity, the list went on and on. And there, right at the bottom of the pile, was the really scary letter. The really scary letter had arrived 3 weeks ago and had cost Elliot more sleep than all the others put together. There were no really scary letters mentioned when Mum had seen the advert on the telly promising instant loans if you owned a house. In fact, the letter that arrived with the cheque to pay for Grandad's funeral, and the bit extra they'd suggested Mum borrow on top, was as friendly as the man on the advert, who seemed very happy about the hassle-free instant cash and affordable monthly repayments. But the monthly repayments weren't that affordable after all, and the cash hadn't been hassle-free, and the man wasn't very friendly when you couldn't pay his money back. "Dear Mrs. Hooper," Elliot read for the millionth time, "we act on behalf of Easy Dosh Limited. Your failure to make payments in accordance with your loan obligation of £20,000 has resulted in proceedings to recover possession of Home Farm, Little Motbury, Wiltshire. If the outstanding monies reach us by 1 calendar month from the date of this letter, no further action will be taken. If you do not take the action required, your home will be repossessed on Friday, the 19th of November." The letter waffled on for another 2 pages, but Elliot understood what it meant in plain English. Unless he found £20,000 in exactly 1 week, he and Mum were going to lose their home. And then where would they go? They had nowhere and no one. Mum was confused enough in the home she'd known all her adult life. There was no way she'd cope with somewhere new. Elliot picked up another letter from the electricity company. We regret to inform you that due to non-payment of your outstanding balance, your service will be terminated on... The rest was lost, as the house was suddenly plunged into darkness. Elliot pulled out the torch, candles and matches he kept nearby for every time the electricity was cut off, and did some rough sums on the back of his maths homework. He could pay the electricity bill tomorrow. Thank you, Mrs. Portley Plum. But that would leave less than £5 for food next week. But next week would have to take care of itself. Elliot quietly vowed that if he were ever rich, he'd never eat a baked bean again. Elliot looked out of the window into the night sky. With no light pollution from the house, the stars sparkled in the cloudless darkness. He smiled as he remembered how he and Mum used to climb onto the cowshed roof to look at the constellations. Tonight he could see the V shape of Pisces, which ruled the sky in November. At other times of the year, he could recognise the circle that formed Aquarius, the kite shape of Scorpio, or triangular Libra. But there wouldn't be any other constellations out tonight. Although he was sure that rectangle of stars was Virgo. But that didn't make any sense. What was it doing in the sky at this time of year? And why was it moving? An aeroplane suddenly roared overhead. Had it hit the Virgo constellation? It looked like it. And was Virgo... He scoffed at his impossible notion. Stars couldn't fall out of the sky. Elliot stared into the darkness as the stars hurtled through the sky. They weren't shooting stars, more like tumbling stars. They were definitely dropping. He peered into the night. He was right. The stars were falling, and every second they came nearer, they gathered speed and size. The stars were out of control. What were they going to hit? His question was quickly answered by an almighty bang a few metres from his window. The stars had come crashing to the ground, right in the middle of his cowshed.